time for the. Okay, thank you so much. Everyone, welcome to Lunch and Learn. I genuinely welcome you all, and I'm a presenter today as well. Thank you for being here. And our past president, Guy Blood, usually starts us off in a good way with the land acknowledgement, which he does one of the best land acknowledgements that is his own. And I hope we can all take them.
With that introduction, I'll probably forget everything I already did. But thank you, Netta. Yes, I want to point out that we are the beneficiaries of Treaty 6, which covers much of northern Saskatchewan and Alberta. And Treaty 6 was requested by the indigenous people of this area in the late 1800s, and they met with the Governor General of the Dominion of Canada at the time and agreed to the contract, which was called Treaty 6, in which they ceded any interest in the land and with the provision that they would have reserved areas for themselves and some medicine and some education and some farm tools and a bit of money. And why would they do this? Well, they saw people coming in, settling on the land, and they had no idea of ownership. And they realized they were being displaced, so they asked for this treaty. And the treaty has been granted and signed by all the chiefs. They have their land, and the country was supposed to give them those things that I mentioned, and they've actually failed in a lot of ways. So we're stuck with that problem, and we're trying to figure out how to resolve it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did a lot of work. There's a C-15 bill passed in Parliament, which asks the government to examine all laws and make sure there's no prejudice against Indigenous people. So, but we're still left with the huge emotional hangover and problems with the relationship between Indigenous and colonizers, or the people that came in, us, and we're the beneficiaries. We've given permission to own this land, and we've done that. Thank you. That's all I got.
Thank you so much. So welcome again, everyone. We have somebody listening to the back doorbell for us. The Forum of the World's Religions was started in 1893 in Chicago as part of the Chicago World's Fair, which is also known as the Columbian Exposition, I think, because celebrating 400 years since Columbus landed in America. And the first one in 1893 was quite an amazing event. Over 26 million people went to Chicago to see that fair over a number of. I'm back to the audience. I don't know how to do this. I try to talk to everybody. So, and it was remarkable. It doesn't matter if they can see. Okay. Thanks, Ian. I'll be less nervous if they can't see. And if I talk too fast, which I tend to do, somebody do that. Thank you. Okay. Vivekananda, he sort of credited with starting the modern interfaith movement. In fact, in Chicago, there's a wonderful plaque to him there. Thomas Edison was there. The first electric light bulb was turned on at the Chicago World's Fair. It was a really big deal. And so 100 years later, somebody thought, what a great idea, we're trying to revive this. There was one in Chicago in 1993, Cape Town, South Africa, 1999, Barcelona, Spain, 2004, Melbourne, Australia, 2009, Salt Lake, USA, 2015, Toronto, 2018, a virtual one in 2021, in Chicago last week, 2023. So Karen and I were there, and we presented a paper. Guy Blood was there. 2 other of our board members were there. We are planning a program for all of us to talk about, and some other people like Peter Rushke was there, one of our members who also presented a paper, and he's spoken to us for Lunch and Learn before. So we're starting to put together a program to talk about our impressions of the Parliament. But there were over 800 sessions over 5 days. It's like a large phone book. Our presentation, Karen's and mine, was on a Thursday afternoon. There were at least 40 different sessions on at the same time, at exactly the same, or overlapping an hour before, an hour behind. There was no time in between, so ours that started 10 minutes late, meant that we were run out of the room by the next group. Those things were not fun, you know, what is fun? They were disruptive, so, and we didn't have our full time, so now I'm going to speak more slowly than I did last week. Thank you. I think everybody was sent a copy of our proposal. Well, and I'm going first. Is that what we agreed?
You're going first.
Okay. Our initial proposal was could only be 1,000 characters long, not 1,000 words, 1,000 characters, which includes spaces. So we had to be very precise, and this was almost a year ago. We said 2,000 years of well-documented Christian anti-Semitism will be briefly summarized. The Holocaust is the most blatant, widespread, and devastating example to date. And although many say never again, we know that that is a false hope. As what happened, as what happened can happen again. Anti-Semitism is flourishing, and hate crime statistics show it clearly. Some of the new anti-Semitism tries to pass itself off as legitimate criticism of Israel. Rather than responding yes, but to legitimate criticism, we say yes and. White supremacy is the common enemy of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as of Jews. Because we are perceived as successful, integrated, and can pass as white, the threat to us is underestimated, and we are often completely left out of discussions of prejudice and hate crimes, and I have examples of this in Edmonton, many examples. We must work together to recognize our common enemy, their history, methods, and motivations to find solutions rather than to compete as victims. So that's what we sent the Parliament many months ago, that's what was in the program. So it is customary and helpful to begin discussions like this by defining terms, and one difficulty I've had doing this is a good indication not only of the complexity of the issue, but also what I see as its contradictory nature. And that is, of course, because prejudice itself is irrational. I'm going to try to stick with that one simple word, prejudice, using it to range from dislike, intolerance, petty microaggressions, which might not be petty to the victim, to the extremes of violent, genocidal hatred. I hope this won't lead to oversimplification, but trying to find an all-encompassing definition would take our whole hour. In the Parliament program of over 100 presentations, there are hundreds addressing this topic from many different perspectives. I quit counting. Many of the general themes we touch on were covered specifically. We know that race is not a valid biological concept, but rather a social construction that gives or denies benefits and privileges. However, even some racialized groups continue to identify ourselves and others as Black, white, people of color, and coin catchy acronyms like BIPOC as shorthand, and in the case of that last one, an attempt to be inclusive. It is counterproductive and leaves out misogyny, sexism, ableism, zealous nationalism, speciesism, and of course, religious supremacy. All these prejudices are not the same, but those who hold them have a lot in common. We need to know our enemies, their motivations and methods, and it's only with our solidarity that we can challenge them. Anti-Semitism has been called the oldest hatred, and we see it as the canary in the coal mine for other biases. At the Parliament, there were plenaries each morning, which the majority of the 6,500 delegates attended. The big names were all there. At one on Tuesday morning, Yael Eisenstadt from the Anti-Definition League said anti-Semitism and misogyny are the canaries. When white supremacists marched in Charlottesville, North Carolina, exactly 6 years ago, in broad daylight, with Nazi and Confederate flags and no need to hide under hoods, something new was exposed in this country. We were in America. Something new and very old. One of their slogans was, Jews will not replace us. Replacement theory states that with cooperation of replacist elites, white Europeans are being replaced culturally and in other ways with non-whites through mass migration and a drop in the birth rate of white Europeans. This conspiracy theory attributes recent demographic changes in North America and Western Europe to intentional policies advanced by global and liberal elites, calling it genocide by substitution. We talked about Canada and the US because this is where we too live, but also acknowledge this is not a white or a Christian problem. Religions for Peace, an American group who were at the Parliament, recently held a webinar addressing Hindu nationalism in America. The speakers were very concerned about Indian Prime Minister Modi's open incitement of violence against Muslims. They compared it to Germany in the 1930s and the world's regret, in hindsight, that the signs of an incipient genocide, or at least ethnic cleansing, were clear. And once again, the world is watching and doing nothing. There was a session immediately following ours addressing the escalating risk of genocide of India's Muslims. Much of recorded human history is one group taking land and resources from another. Might makes right was a common saying, but we know that is wrong, so we have to rationalize. God gave this land to me. Europeans conquered people all over the world for the glory of God, king, and country. The gold and silver and slaves, and more recently oil, were secondary, I suppose. There were phrases that actually tried to justify this: manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius. Under these ideas, indigenous populations worldwide have been decimated and the damage is ongoing. Because our audience was mainly American, I said, you may not be aware that Canada also has a shameful history of a deliberate and almost successful genocide of our own First Peoples. Their rates of incarceration, poverty, ill health, lower life expectancy, poor maternal outcomes, and on are much higher than their percentage of the population, similar to statistics for Black Americans. Americans talk a lot about freedom, seeming to forget the role played by slavery in the foundation of the country. Slavery was also legal in Canada for over 160 years. An embarrassing number of us are either ignorant of or in denial of this history. These are the original sins of our glorious nations. A year ago, the Pope visited our city, which has the second largest urban indigenous population in Canada. They prayed and wept that he would rescind the teachings that had justified the terrible oppression. He did not. 8 months later, back in Rome, he did. Just 2 years ago, he restricted the use of the Latin Mass that includes a prayer for the conversion of the Jews. And 1 month ago, the Anglican Church formally removed a prayer also aimed at saving our souls. Local and national conflicts are about power and politics. Those with the power to do so may withhold certain rights from another group because they feel superior to them, but it is more likely a justification after the fact that they simply do not want to share resources equally. Israel, Palestine, Protestants, Catholic, Tutsi, Hutu, sectarian violence, tribalism, fear, and mistrust, otherness with people who live side by side. So what is really going on here? In many cases,
ready to connect.
In many cases, if closely examined, we would find religious and political leaders who are exacerbating differences for their own ends. Identity politics divides us, and we are dividing and conquering ourselves, seeking the same money, attention, a seat at the table. It should not be a competition. Applying for grants, federal, provincial, and municipal, coming from different departments, status of women, heritage, multiculturalism. Many of us are familiar with this world. Make not-for-profit groups fight each other. Instead, we should be encouraged to design programs that promote cooperation. The victimized should not have to compete with each other.
LA 5 CMDP 86.
Could you all please mute yourselves?
You should be able to do all
I know I can't find it here.
Oh, thanks. As two speakers at the Parliament that I did manage to hear said, it is not a zero-sum game. I've been influenced by the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. We know the phrase systemic racism. He says racist policies create racism, not the other way around. Marianne Williamson was another powerful speaker last week and said to a standing ovation, the system is sociopathic. Everything is about power. Look for who benefits from humans being divided against each other. None of it is accidental. We are prejudiced against those who are not like us. To call someone a racist is often to shut down all reasonable dialogue because it's such a terrible word. Opposing sides in a conflict race to see who can accuse the other of it first. Humans still have a tribal mentality, tendency to circle the wagons when the tribe is threatened, and it is this we must work against. Jews are afraid, and fear is the worst motivator of action. Israelis continue to elect Netanyahu as prime minister because he stokes their existential fear. And I'm not saying that fear is unfounded. He is the strong man they want right now, sad to say. There was one Jew at our presentation who said to me after, the Jewish university students are afraid on campus. I said, yes, so are Muslims, LGBTQ plus, etc. It's terrible, and how wonderful it would be that they find a way to support each other. The reason, of course, that this was a suitable topic at a religious conference is it's not only secular leaders who scapegoat and dehumanize others for their own ends. Religious leaders know very well how to use scripture and doctrine, as well as religious fervor and nationalism, to inflame the passions of their followers. Sadly, it is all too easy to convince humans to kill each other. But at the root of it all is dehumanization of the other, denying them the same basic humanity that we all share according to our doctrines. President Biden recently said, our intelligence agencies have determined that domestic terrorism rooted in white supremacy, including anti-Semitism, is the greatest terrorist threat to our homeland today. This has been building for decades, but has managed to stay under the radar because too many of us allowed ourselves to be convinced of a mythical terrorist from somewhere else, not one of us. It is hard to recognize the enemy within. If he or she look like me, what might that say about me and mine? What responsibility must I take? I do and say and think and teach. I'm a fan of George Orwell and reread 1984 every decade or so, and each time it is more frightening. I love words and the fact that language is alive, the words change and have a natural evolution with usage. To show how totalitarianism works, Orwell invented newspeak, doublethink, Big Brother, the Ministry of Truth, and slogans like war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. The indoctrination is what we now call brainwashing. Something similar is happening when words like woke have been deliberately subverted. In reference to the fact that marginalized and victimized groups sometimes fail to be in competition with, I'm reminded of Orwell's Animal Farm, in which all animals are equal, some are more equal. Thanks very much, Shake. I'm not much of a user of social media, but of course I'm aware of its power, its reach, its ability to not only spread this information, but now to actually create it. Confirmation bias is real. To conclude, I used to think of racism as a contagious disease, a virus that is too easily transmitted, that we need to inoculate our children against it. That education is the answer. Education is an answer, but dismantling racist policies is the key. And since they are created by, and support capitalism and patriarchy, we're talking about nothing less than truly changing the world. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. Dr. Farkas.
Okay, so
I'm, oh, Karen's clear. It was a little hard sometimes to hear you, Netta, but I'd actually read it before, so not all of it.
Thanks, Bud.
so a question I have is, why is the topic of anti-Semitism so important to me and to many other Jews? My grade 10 Sunday school teacher had her family driven out of their home in my hometown in Pennsylvania because they were Jewish. The small subdivision in which they had purchased a home was union-free, and the residents wanted to keep it that way. As you can find in Wikipedia, with even a cursory search, the persecution of Jews has been a major event in Jewish history. We have been, from time to time, expelled from most European and Eastern countries and cities, some more than once. Rome, Egypt, Cyprus, Medina, Spain, France, Italy, Switzerland, Hungary, Austria, Bavaria, Portugal, most of the Papal States, Brazil, Yemen, Haiti, most of Russia, and after World War II, over 800,000 Jews were expelled from the Middle East and North Africa. When not totally removed, Jews were often subject to slaughter and in many cases had strict limits placed on our allowed places of residence and occupations. Even in the US, when I was hired by an insurance company in 1970, my father said, "Oh, are insurance companies hiring Jews now?" He was totally unaware that that had changed. All of this history has prompted shifting waves of refugees and the formation of diaspora communities, primarily in Israel and the United States and Canada. Now we are feeling threatened in these previously safe countries. Jerome Chains, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for Jewish History at the City University of New York, identifies the historical development of anti-Semitism, which was primarily ethnic in nature. Then came Christian anti-Semitism in antiquity and the Middle Ages, which was religious in nature and has extended into modern times. Political, social, and economic anti-Semitism occurred during the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment Europe, laying the groundwork for racial anti-Semitism. Racial anti-Semitism arose in the 19th century and culminated in Nazism and the Holocaust. Now we have contemporary anti-Semitism, which has been labeled by some as the new anti-Semitism. As you should be aware by now, however, there is nothing new about anti-Semitism. It just changes its hairstyle, clothing, or language. In all cases, the results are devastating. I want to change focus to discuss differences between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israel. I am not very happy with the current government here in Canada or in Alberta. I speak out against actions taken by both the federal and provincial politicians in power. Interestingly, they are from opposing parties. Yes, I do not ever question the right of either the nation or the province to exist, however. Although Canada has been my country of residence for well over half of my life, I am also still a citizen of the United States. I have been most unhappy with more than one of the prior presidents and have complained with great passion on many occasions. But I was complaining about the people in power and the decisions they were making, not questioning whether they had obtained their power legitimately or whether the entire country should be given up on. I hear anti-Israel hatred rather than anti-Israeli government hatred. Whether Israel will continue to be a Jewish nation in the future is something I can't predict, but right now it is. That means that general Israel bashing is Jew bashing. Specific complaints about government or military policies are legitimate, and I admit to agreeing with many of them. But careless use of language translates into a perception, real or not, of general hatred of Jews. The question I have is, how do we get rid of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, misogyny, ageism, ableism, LGBTQ plus discrimination, and all the rest? My personal belief is that people hate out of fear. Not so much fear of the other, but fear of being disadvantaged themselves and of having the world with which they have become comfortable changing in ways they don't yet understand. I think that what is needed is for governments to start shifting their focus to housing, feeding, clothing, educating, and providing health care to all people living in their borders. We need to shift the focus from goods to good and from growth to sustainability. We need to stop spending money on traveling, money and resources on traveling great distances to attend conferences such as the Parliament. Consumed mass quantities of paper, plastic, and energy. COVID was a blessing in that it introduced us to a more helpful way of meeting, as we can see on the screen in front of us. I am not proposing that we cease all in-person interactions. Meeting with and sharing with others is a good thing. But we must shift our own focus to healing ourselves, our families, our communities, our neighborhoods, cities, and onward in an increasing circle until we understand the values of peaceful coexistence on a gut level. What does this pie in the sky proposal have to do with prejudice and anti-Semitism? As Netta says, competition for resources sets up an unhealthy adversarial mindset. In Canada, we have the government and the loyal opposition. They are called loyal because they are presumably loyal to the country. They are called the opposition because they are expected to criticize and oppose the party in power. What does this teach our youth and the general public? That one should oppose rather than support? I was lectured on these last comments by an attendee at our presentation in Chicago. He was a Canadian who claimed that without a loyal opposition, we would have a one-party authoritarian ruler. I think he missed my point. It is not that I don't think we need to keep an eye on what the government is doing and question when we think there are problems. My point is the importance of the language that we use to describe things, not whether there are people safeguarding us with checks and balances in Parliament. The language we use to call it an opposition assumes that they will always oppose whatever the government does. This creates a mindset of negativity, in my opinion. When we use terms such as opposition, prosecution, disability, minority, etc., we are putting an idea in a person's head. It is why we stopped using he in all cases as a pronoun when talking about someone who could be either male or female in a particular profession. But getting back to what I'm trying to say, the question is why so many of our organizations are either set up to be or described as adversarial. I was a corporate finance professor, thus a teacher of capitalism. I did insist that my students consider externalities and not easily quantifiable effects of decisions. But most decision-making in finance boils down to dollars and cents. I now see the dangers and pitfalls of allowing the uncontrolled, invisible hand of capitalism to be the major driving force. Mea culpa. What do I want? I want an equitable world in which my grandchildren can coexist with the world without fear, without hate, without greed, and without need. This will only happen when we reshape our economies and outlooks to see each other as worthy, equal, and lovable beings, like Audrey and her cat. So what do the rest of you think about a necessary path to an equitable world in which we reach the goal of eradicating prejudice? That's what we need to talk about and hear. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
Who's the candidate?
Shouldn't be a contention in mind that they know that if a very virtuous opposition always opposes, as soon as the Trudeau government, for example, can do nothing right, that's impossible.
absolutely, I agree.
well, I'm annoyed at the lies and half truths they used to do that. Like, when the inflation rate, was not down as low as what everybody wanted, it was announced on the radio, the two things they quoted Governor Everett as saying were just inflation, which of course is a half truth, because Justin is not responsible for all the inflation, it's a worldwide thing. And half like he's giving, budget will balance itself, that's half of what he said. The other half was if we grow the economy, the budget will balance itself. And what he was advocating for was economic stimulus. He actually sounded like he knew what he was talking about in that quote.
Well,
Yeah.
no one person, thank goodness, can have that much effect on our economy.
No,
If that were possible, we would be in huge trouble. So that's the one thing.
but
Yeah, so it's less than a half truth. Yes.
I really like your point about the way we speak about things.
Yeah.
Including like that whole business of the loyal opposition, like the concept has its merits in that, you're the other voice, and there are, you're representing the people who didn't vote for the government and may have concerns, but that opposition, and you see that, but I mean, it's.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how we get rid of before my kids went on holidays, we were talking about this and sort of the language of racism, and we were looking at two countries where we've been aware of it. One was the UK and the other was Japan, where they have a very interesting racism because it's a polite racism.
Well, Japan in particular.
Yeah, especially, it's a very polite racism. I mean, you will never be Japanese. And you never really belong there.
No.
But they will be nice to you and feed you and look after you and hope you go away.
I don't know, language has changed so much since my youth. I remember when being gay was a really nice way to feel. It was
Well, that be happy.
when we were gay. And there are other words like,
Well,
I don't know.
well, one thing that interests me is you get some words that change their meaning, or they've been bad words, but then they get rehabilitated because a group decides they want to use them. And you get other words that get banned.
And it's not bad. There's nothing bad about being gay the way it was when I was little, or being gay the way it's defined now. There's nothing bad about either one, but it's perception, it's the way people perceive.
And it's been going on forever, like,
Yeah.
those people that are called Methodists. That was originally an insult.
Christian was originally an insult.
But from who is insulting whom, like?
Oh, for the Methodists, it was the regular Anglicans.
Yeah.
They looked at these people and all their organization and whatnot, and just said they did everything in order and very methodical. They were Methodists.
Yeah, the Western Teutonic Methodism were Anglicans, they're both, well, one of them was an Anglican minister, actually. And they had a religious experience and decided that they needed to do more to become closer to God. And started changing procedures, and that's how they got the name Methodist. They didn't ever intend to leave the Anglican Church. Oh,
And Christian was originally a pejorative used in Antioch. For the followers, they called themselves the followers of the way, but it was this newfangled thing with the.
May I suggest that both of these speeches will be sent via email? Because it was hard to follow, like, I mean, I think some of us are hard hearing, some just whatever. So anyways, these are very good documents to actually research and understand. And it came from minds for people that have lived a long life to be able to express their opinion for what we are seeing right now. So there should be a follow-up in which, like, I myself would like to read it and just process what's being said. But just for example, one comment in what Karen has presented, because I already have forgot what Netta has presented.
It was good.
But it was good.
Yeah.
It was good, and I will probably get back to it, but just one comment, all the list of the places that the Jews have been persecuted and kicked out of. I take exception with Egypt, not because I'm Egyptian, but because how the Jews came into Egypt, established themselves as a result of the prophecy of Joseph. And they were directed to leave Egypt as a result of a prophecy of Moses. So this was, again, I don't use the word God because it is very generic. I use the word Allah, where I can relate to. And I believe Jews started to be persecuted after they left Egypt. And just a second, you don't have to correct me. I'm just saying, as a result of a speech you have given that gave me a point to look into and see where that can come together or come apart. And then the story is too long. This is humanity in operation.
Oh, absolutely.
This is, and what we can judge right now, this is a history that has been millions of years in the making, and now what that we are dealing with. But what we can see right now is something that was still prophesied, that we are not individuals. We are a creation that is right now is coming together into being one body in operation. And just like any one of us that has millions of cells that compose what a body is, and every cell has a function and has a place and has a this and that and has actually a lifespan that's different from other cells. It's just a very big story. So to be continued. I mean, I don't want to take the setting, but.
And that's part of why it would be good to have this provided to people in writing so that they can make comments to the group and to us in writing. And we have an opportunity to respond or not, or agree or not, as we want. And it would be a lovely
Ongoing discussion.
dialogue, going on.
Can we make it happen?
sure.
Oh, I think it'd be
Well,
great.
you sent yours out already, didn't you?
No, that
It
was
is-
just the summary.
Just
of
the
it.
summary.
Yeah.
Oh,
We could, I mean, I suppose we could post it on the Interfaith website. And have it as an ongoing dialogue.
Yeah, Karen, did you mean Egypt in the Exodus, in the biblical Exodus, or in modern times?
Well, killed in ancient Egypt and, with all the firstborn, and then in more modern
Yeah.
times.
And Judas were,
Very applicable,
Judas were.
very applicable.
And so the sad thing is that it happened in the US, I'm gonna get this mixed up. Either during or right after the Civil War, General Grant, I believe, wanted to remove all the Jews from the southern United States.
Mhm.
And he had what he thought were good reasons to do this. And it didn't, the president at the time said, probably not politically a great idea. Never said it's a good idea, generally, but not politically. And so no country is innocent of this. I think that it's I've read books that take place in novels that take place in Russia when there were huge areas where Jews were just not allowed to live, not allowed to even enter. And it boggles the mind that has been the case. I guess people think they can tell a Jew from a distance or whatever, but I don't know.
Anyone else, please?
If I could, I take a spiritual approach to everything, so I think like the one thing that might unify us in this room is that we all want to be at peace and live in a world that's at
We do, yes.
And my point is that trying to change the external circumstances is not the first priority. The first priority is your own peace of mind. And bring that peace of mind and that love to any situation that you encounter. And that means essentially that there's no room in your heart for anger or upset or anything else, regardless of circumstance. I know that's maybe an extreme position, but that's where I see it, is that we have to realize our oneness, that our separation, our feeling of separation from our creator and our source is our only real problem.
Yeah.
And when we do that, our view of the world changes. We don't demand that something change before we can be at peace. We take peace into whatever circumstance we encounter.
But I think there is the aspect of it where, doing that work, the internal peacefulness, but there are times when we do need to speak out. When we can name where we see, evil, errors, bad stuff, and name it.
Yeah, but when we do, we essentially attack ourselves.
But it still needs to be said.
Well, can we say it without anger
Yes.
and without hatred?
And be constructive and recognize error instead of, say, for want of a better word, that we've made a mistake, but that the essential person that we view there is a reflection of ourselves.
Yes.
Well, this is something I'd like to see our opposition politicians do more. Looking at the government policies and saying, I do not like that policy. Yeah. I want to change it, and this is what I like, instead of attacking person.
Yes, that would be lovely.
Kahindi, you had your hand up.
I was just reflecting on the issue of prejudice, that I think sometimes, prejudice is it's not only from one side, only mutual. But the expression depends on who has the power to express the prejudice. Okay. The gifted people's community, like the Jews, in all their history. I mean, look at even the way Shakespeare portrayed them in his literature, very negative. But focusing on their strength, what had them, their resourcefulness, their sense of community, sense of belonging, and some of it, which others who do not belong to the community feel frightened about. Okay. But they were minority everywhere. And so they suffered, okay? And so I'm looking at it, when we look at it globally, I'm wondering whether we don't see the same dynamics in communities where small communities that are vulnerable, gifted, they become a subject of persecution and oppression. Or if the people who are powerful, who are afraid, for one reason or the other, themselves are oppressing others because of their own fear within themselves. So I think there's this, that is why, the point you just made about, looking at ourselves is very important. Look at the politics in Nigeria, this time in the electioneering. You have these people from southeastern Nigeria who have suffered during the Civil War and who have lifted themselves from the ashes of the war. And through mutual empowerment, they have prospered, they have lied very well. They've been marginalized in the governance of the country. And one of them came up and he has this support across the various ethnic groups. But because he's an evil person, because he's not, it doesn't belong to the ruling, my own people and northern people, because it doesn't belong. They stole the election. And the people, the hatred, the envy, the jealousy of the prosperity of people became subject of hatred. And their buildings were burnt down, their houses were being demolished in broad daylight. No one is supposed to say anything about it. But now, we never had this kind of experiences, the experience of civil war. We had an opportunity that we were built, but we couldn't do it. And here we see people who saw themselves as building a future. So the fear of the fact that this will become prosperous has become, their vulnerable point. And we see this again and again, So there's the economic factor, and this insecurity of the powerful in the face of this minority that is, deriving their own power from another part of their own giftedness. And as long as these dynamics are there, I think each of us need to be looking inward. It is very, very important, to have ourselves grounded inside. Because, otherwise, the people just continue, and we can easily be swept along, in the prejudice, the hate, and the rest of it. Thank you.
So what do you think the Richard conflict is doing right now, many of their issues, right? Every in North America, anywhere. I mean, you're talking about the Nigerian issues.
Yes.
But look at the Eritrean issues, look at the Syrian issues, look at it, start to look, you'll find that there is a built-in hatred in human beings that is taking it on each other, regardless of anything. It is from within.
Yes.
I think it's fear. I would not call it hatred. I would call it fear.
What would you call it? Ignorance.
That's true, I think.
Well, I'm educated. I'm enlightened.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, like the real meaning of ignorance means I don't know, and that can be fixed.
That creates fear. When you don't know, you fear of what's unknown.
Ignorance can be fixed.
Well, and I think it's also powerlessness, where you don't think you can change things yourself, so you look for a powerful leader to do for you.
I don't.
I think it's part of what got Trump in, actually. He went to people who were in the restaurant and said,
No.
oh yeah, I know you don't have the good jobs you used to have, you don't have a very good future, I can fix that. Well, he didn't, of course. But I think because they were powerless to do it themselves, they were willing to look at him and say, he's looking at us, he says he can fix it, we'll follow him.
He was saying what Hitler was saying.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
It was the same
Yeah.
kind of rhetoric, the exact same rhetoric, and people were unhappy, and so they needed to blame someone for their unhappiness, and so he said it's the Jews, and the communists,
Uh-huh.
and the Mormons, or, yeah, and
Well, there's a whole list.
the whole list, the homosexuals and gypsies. That's who is causing our terrible economy. If we can get rid of them,
And the liberals.
Well, you know what's what a lot of dictators do is get rid of the educated
oh, absolutely.
right away. People who might talk back.
It's not an easy thing to change. And that's why I believe you've said basically, this, we have to start with ourselves.
Definitely.
We have to start internally and be very careful in our interactions with the people in our immediate circle, and then moving outward, that we are, okay, Larry needs to say something.
I can speak, and I just want to respond to, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I want to respond to what Karen just said, but what other people have said as well. It's when we start othering people, when we start speaking about people as other, that it begins the steps towards making them less and less human. And that's the process that ends in genocide, when you no longer think of other people as being human, and so they have no value and can be destroyed. I heard this described really well when I visited Rwanda, and they were talking about how, the question about how the genocide developed there. And it began with that sense of stopping talking about other people as being human beings, but you attach a label to them and then they become less human. And I think that really one of the things that does is it really underlines, Karen, your comment about being careful about how we use language, and really examining whether our language is really reflecting respect for other human beings, or whether it's getting us hooked into that notion of othering people.
I sat next to Larry at something one time, and people were talking about cisgender, and I had never heard that term. And I thought, well, here's someone next to me who's probably a safe person to ask. Too much trouble. So I asked him and he explained it, but the language is changing too fast for me to absorb. I don't know, maybe I'm too old, but it's just, I like to stick with my old words.
I think though there is a recognition, I mean, I occasionally get eye rolls from my offspring when I say something and they realize that sort of like, yeah, your language is kind of out of date. You might want to update. And kind of, oh yeah, Dad. Yeah, people aren't saying that anymore.
Yeah, everything is evolved. Everything is evolved.
So I try to keep up, but it is a challenge, but I think it is something we need to be conscious of. So I mean, we will make mistakes, we will say the wrong thing. But I think also the intention, like some people use language as a weapon. Like the other Larry was saying, when you other somebody by the language you use. Where you
Downsize them, yeah.
yeah.
I wonder if we other the radical right, whether we discounted them as people to talk to or reason with because they're hopeless, although they're, especially in the US, very, very powerful.
Well, yeah, very good point.
I think it's important to dialogue with people who are of another mind than ourselves, and to ask non-threatening questions, to encourage them to explain why they think the way they do, where they're coming, and sometimes they won't, and sometimes people can't. Sometimes I can't explain why I'm feeling something that I'm feeling. But we know many people, when we winter in Arizona, it's a hotbed of right wing.
Well, there's a real skill to that, and I'm not very good at it.
It's the weather.
You have to be able to ask, well, Yeah, and
But we have maintained friendships
Yeah.
with some people who are just totally the other end of the spectrum from us.
yeah,
They have good hearts, they're loving people, they're caring people. And we each feel that the other has somewhere gone astray, I guess. And, but that doesn't mean you give up and say, I'm not gonna talk to you anymore, because then you lose the opportunity to learn something.
but I think you do get to, you know, you avoid the pitfalls, you avoid certain topics.
It's frustrating.
Yeah.
It's-
Oh, yeah. Like my own church, the United Church, was always priding itself on being inclusive, and it talks about it all the time. But it often isn't, because when somebody said one time, all right, if we're so inclusive, would we welcome Donald Trump into our worship? Okay, maybe I'm not that inclusive.
Well,
It was sort of like that, you know, if you're going to say inclusive and welcoming, you have to do more than just pick and choose who you're inclusive
The thing-
and welcoming.
Thing is, if you invite somebody like Donald Trump in your worship, he will take over. And that's a major problem. Like Karen said, no one person can make a major damage. But actually, if you look at the individuals,
Yeah.
if you look at the individuals who cause major damage, example, Hitler, for example, one person managed to congregate people into major hatred. Look at, for example, and the damage he's doing right now. Luckily, they are taking him on and not letting him do his way.
we will
But
see.
look at all the dictatorships, how they eliminate opposing voice.
Well, that is what the well-meaning man in Chicago was trying to tell me
Yeah.
when he was lecturing me. That if we didn't have a loyal opposition, we would end up with an authoritarian or totalitarian government. And I don't believe that. I don't want to believe it. I want to believe that there are. I've been very disheartened in the last several years because of what's happened to the Republican Party in the United States, but I want to believe that there are people of good will and good conscience who will, when the time, when it's needed, will step forward and do something.
Will you believe, just give me a second, do you believe what Allah said? As a general rule, which I bring in just about the discussion, it's this way. The verse says, if it wasn't for Allah pushing people against each other, the earth would have gone corrupt. So there is always that chance when somebody says right, somebody comes and say left. So the balance
I hear
would
you.
come together.
Yeah, okay, it's a good point.
In the interest of time, it is after 1, so we're going to officially close and thank our speakers.
Thank you.
Okay, saying there's a question, Audrey? Audrey, you're muted. Audrey, you are muted.
We can see your lips now.
Don wanted to speak quite a while ago and never got the chance because you guys were using your power over there and not looking at.
Okay.
Sorry, who did Audrey?
I said Dawn wanted to speak and nobody let her in.
Dawn, please.
Dawn, go ahead.
I'd like to strongly recommend the Fringe play, which is at French University, and it's called Anatolia Speaks, and about a refugee to Canada. It is a very moving story, and it deals with ethnic cleansing and what it's like to be a new Canadian in Edmonton.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Don. So we're gonna stop the recording now. I made a fresh pot of tea. People come, go, please, but